The morning air in Oakhaven was crisp, biting through the thin fabric of my worn-out denim jacket. For the rest of the town, today was a celebration of glory, a homecoming for the Steel Sentinels unit. For me, it was the day I would finally see my sister, Helena, after 24 months of radio silence and redacted letters. I stood pressed against the cold metal of the police barricades, my boots scuffing the asphalt. Beside me, our parents were a portrait of suburban pride. My father wore his old regimental tie, his chest puffed out so far I thought his buttons might pop, while my mother clutched a "Welcome Home" captain's sign with knuckles white from the cold. They hadn't stopped talking about Helena's decorations since the news broke that her unit was returning. "Stand up straight, Elias," my father barked, though his eyes were fixed on the horizon where the rhythmic beat of drums was getting louder. "Try to look like you're part of this family today. Your sister is a hero. The least you can do is show some discipline." I didn't argue. I never did anymore. In their eyes, I was the one who stayed behind, the one who chose community college and a quiet job at the local youth center over the noble path of the academy. To them, I was the static background noise to Helena's symphony of achievements. Then the ground began to vibrate. The high school marching band led the way, their brass instruments gleaming under the pale autumn sun. But the atmosphere shifted the moment the military vehicles rounded the corner. The crowd erupted. It was a wall of sound, cheers, whistles, and frantic waving. And there she was. Captain Helena Vance was leading the 3rd Platoon on foot. She looked different, harder if that was possible. Her uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to draw blood. Her medals clinked softly against her chest, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that announced her status. Her jaw was set in that familiar granite-hard line, and her eyes, once filled with the mischief of our childhood games of hide-and-seek, were now like cold flint, staring straight into the distance. As she drew closer, my heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered the last thing she told me before she deployed. "Try not to get into trouble while I'm gone, Elias. Some of us have to actually make something of our lives." I wanted to show her that I had. I wanted her to see that I wasn't that scrawny kid anymore. As her boots hit the pavement in perfect synchronization with her squad, she passed directly in front of us. We were so close I could see the faint scar running along her temple. "Helena! Over here!" my mother shrieked, waving the sign frantically. My father let out a sharp, guttural whistle. "That's my girl. Look at her go." I didn't yell. I just waited for the moment our eyes would meet. I leaned over the barricade, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I raised a hand, a simple gesture of recognition between siblings. "Look at me, El. See that I'm here." Helena's head turned slightly. For a fraction of a second, her gaze swept over the spot where we stood. It wasn't a crowded blur to her. She was trained to notice details, to identify faces in a split second. She saw our father's pride. She saw our mother's tears. And she saw me. Her eyes locked onto mine for a heartbeat. I expected a nod, a smirk. Even a frown would have been a bridge. Instead, her expression didn't flicker. It was as if she were looking at a lamppost or a crack in the sidewalk. Her eyes remained vacant of any warmth or recognition. With a deliberate, icy precision, she snapped her head back to the front, her chin tilting a fraction higher. She didn't just ignore me. She erased me. She marched past us, her boots striking the ground with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. The physical distance between us was barely 3 feet, but in that moment, she had placed an entire ocean between our lives. "Did you see that?" my mother gasped, oblivious to the sting. "She's so focused, such a professional. She didn't let anything distract her from her duty." "That's a soldier for you," my father agreed, clapping his hands together. "Pure steel. She's moved beyond this little town already." I lowered my hand slowly, the cold air suddenly feeling much sharper. I looked at the retreating back of my sister, the hero of Oakhaven, who couldn't spare a single blink for the brother who had written her every week for 2 years without a single reply. The crowd continued to roar, but for me, the parade had gone silent. I was invisible. I was the problematic brother who didn't fit the narrative of the Vance family glory. I felt a hand on my shoulder, not my father's, but a man standing behind us, a veteran in a faded cap who had been watching the exchange. He didn't say anything, but his grip was firm, his eyes fixed on me with a strange, knowing intensity. "She doesn't see it yet, kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the drums. "But they will." I didn't know what he meant. I just watched Helena disappear into the sea of camouflage and flags, her shadow long and cold on the street I had spent the last 2 years trying to rebuild. She thought she was the only one who had been at war. She had no idea that while she was fighting in a desert halfway across the world, I had been fighting for the soul of this town, and the people she had forgotten were about to let her know exactly who I was. The parade transitioned into a formal assembly at the town square, a sprawling stone plaza dominated by a temporary wooden stage draped in bunting. The air was thick with the scent of fried dough from street vendors and the metallic tang of the metals gleaming on the rows of uniforms. I sat in the Family of Honor section, a row of folding chairs directly behind the VIP podium. My father sat to my left, his back as straight as a board, and my mother to my right, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I, however, felt like a ghost haunting a celebration of my own funeral. Helena sat on the stage, flanked by the mayor and a 3-star general. She was the center of the universe. Every camera lens was trained on her. Every whispered comment from the bleachers was a tribute to her bravery. From where I sat, I could only see the back of her head, her hair tucked into a bun so tight it looked painful. She never turned around. Not once did she check to see if her family was comfortable or if I was even there. "Look at her, Elias," my father whispered, his voice vibrating with a harsh edge. "That's what focus looks like. That's what it means to be a Vance. I hope you're taking notes instead of daydreaming about your little projects at the center." "I'm here, Dad," I said quietly, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. "Being here isn't enough," he retorted, not even looking at me. "You're a spectator in your own sister's life. You could have been up there on that stage with her if you had an ounce of her drive. Instead, you're just here." The ceremony began, and the mayor launched into a long-winded speech about the Oakhaven spirit. He spoke of sacrifice and the heavy burden of those who serve. As he talked, I looked around the square. I saw faces I recognized, not from the society pages, but from the dark corners of the town. I saw Mr. Henderson, a veteran who almost lost his house last winter until I helped him navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of his pension. I saw Sarah, whose husband was in Helena's unit, holding a toddler who had been sick for weeks while Sarah worked double shifts. I was the one who had organized the local grocery drive to keep their pantry full. They were all here, standing in the back, away from the VIP seats. They looked tired, worn down by the reality of the lives the soldiers had left behind. Then Helena stood up to speak. The applause was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old clock tower. She stepped to the microphone, her movements robotic and precise. "Duty is not a choice. It is a mandate," Helena began, her voice amplified and echoing across the bricks. "When I was in the field, I didn't think about home as a place of comfort. I thought of it as a responsibility. We fight so that the peace here remains undisturbed. We sacrifice our youth so that those who stay behind can live their quiet, simple lives." She used the word simple like a polite insult. I felt my mother's hand tighten on my arm, but it wasn't a gesture of support. She was leaning on me to get a better view of her golden child. Helena continued, her speech becoming a litany of hardships. She spoke of the heat, the fear, and the brotherhood of the barracks. She spoke as if she were the only person from Oakhaven who had ever known struggle. "There are those who serve," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd but pointedly skipping over the family section. "And there are those who merely benefit from that service. To my fellow soldiers, I say, you are the backbone of this nation. To the civilians, I say, remember the price of your security." The tension in my chest felt like a physical weight. I thought of the nights I spent at the community center until 2 a.m., helping the wives of her own soldiers fill out medical forms they couldn't understand. I thought of the simple life I led, working 2 jobs to fund a grassroots mental health initiative for returning privates because the local VA was backlogged for months. Beside me, my father leaned over. "Listen to her, Elias. She's talking about people like you, the benefiters. While she was bleeding for her country, you were playing social worker. It's embarrassing, frankly, to have the town hero and the town flake in the same row." I looked at the ground. The wooden planks of the stage were scarred and weathered. I felt a surge of hot, bitter resentment. It wasn't that I wanted the medals or the applause. I had never done any of it for the glory. But the blatant erasure, the way my own sister spoke as if the town had stayed in a vacuum while she was gone, stung more than any insult my father could hurl. Helena finished her speech with a sharp salute. The general stood up, clapping slowly, followed by the rest of the dignitaries. The crowd began to cheer again, but this time, the sound felt different. It wasn't as uniform as before. In the back of the square, near the fountain, a group of men in tattered work jackets didn't clap. They were looking at each other, then looking at me. They saw the way Helena had ignored me on the street. They heard the way she talked down to the civilians who had actually been the ones keeping the town from falling apart. The atmosphere in the square began to shift. It was subtle at first. A low murmur, a rustle of movement in the back rows. The mayor went to the microphone to announce the Civic Merit Awards, usually a boring formality where they gave a plaque to a local business owner. "And now," the mayor said, shuffling his papers, "before we conclude the military honors for Captain Vance, we have a special recognition requested by the Veterans Outreach Committee." Helena remained standing at the edge of the stage, her arms behind her back, looking bored. She thought the show was over. She thought she had already won the day. She didn't notice the way the people in the back were starting to push forward, ignoring the ushers. She didn't see the veteran from the street corner, the one who had held my shoulder, moving toward the front with a grim look of determination. The silence that followed the mayor's words was heavy, expectant. My heart began to race. Something was happening, something that wasn't on the official program. I looked at Helena's profile. She was staring off into the distance, still pretending I didn't exist, her chin held high in arrogant silence. She had no idea that the simple life she despised was about to speak back. The mayor cleared his throat, his hand hovering over a small, unscripted note that had been pushed onto the lectern by a silver-haired man in a VFW vest. On the stage, Helena shifted her weight, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. To her, this was the tedious part of the afternoon, the local politics, the small-town fluff that followed the real event. She adjusted her gloves, her eyes scanning the horizon, looking everywhere except at the chairs where we sat. As I was saying, the mayor continued, his voice wavering slightly with newfound gravity. "This year, the community has seen a transformation. While our brave men and women were overseas, a different kind of battle was being fought right here on these streets. A battle against despair, against poverty, and against the neglect of our own." My father let out a soft, mocking huff. "Here we go. More talk about community spirit. Probably going to give a trophy to the guy who fixed the library roof." But the murmur in the back of the square was growing. It wasn't the polite chatter of a crowd waiting for the exit. It was a rhythmic, rising tide of voices. It started near the fountain, where the group of veterans stood. A single voice, gravelly and loud, cut through the mayor's preamble. "Elias." The name hung in the air for a second, sharp and unexpected. Helena's head snapped slightly to the left. It was the first time I saw her composure slip. Her brow furrowed, a tiny crease of confusion appearing between her eyes. She knew that name. It was the name of the brother she had just spent an hour publicly categorizing as a mere beneficiary of her sacrifice. She likely thought it was a mistake, a heckler or a confused drunk. "Elias! Elias! Elias!" The chant picked up speed. It wasn't just the veterans now. It was Sarah, the mother I'd helped with groceries. It was the shopkeepers from the strip mall that I'd helped organize into a co-op to survive the winter. It was the teenagers from the youth center who finally had a place to go because I'd spent my weekends scrubbing graffiti and painting walls. Within seconds, the chant was a roar. The sound bounced off the brick walls of the courthouse and the old bank, a wall of percussion that drowned out the mayor's microphone. Elias! 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 I sat frozen, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mother's hand dropped from my arm in shock, her mouth hanging open. My father was staring at the crowd, his face pale, his eyes darting back and forth as if looking for the real Elias they were shouting for. He couldn't reconcile the son he called a town flake with the name being roared by hundreds of people. On the stage, the change in Helena was fascinating and terrible to watch. The mask of the Steel Sentinel was cracking. She looked at the general, expecting him to order the crowd to settle, but the general wasn't looking at her. He was leaning forward, squinting into the audience, trying to locate the source of this sudden, organic uprising. Helena finally did it. She turned her head. She looked down at the family section, her eyes wide and searching. When they landed on me, they weren't cold anymore. They were filled with a frantic, buzzing confusion. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had stolen her brother's face. She looked for the scrawny kid, she remembered. But all she saw was a man sitting quietly in a denim jacket, surrounded by the thunder of his own name. The mayor gave up on the microphone and simply stepped back, gesturing toward the crowd. The chanting didn't stop. It grew more intense, more demanding. People began to stand up in the middle sections, turning around to look at me. I felt 1,000 eyes pressing in. The veterans at the back began to march forward, not in a military drill, but in a solid, unstoppable wave, parting the sea of folding chairs. They weren't cheering for the uniform. They weren't cheering for the medals. They were cheering for the person who had stayed when everyone else had left. "What is this?" my father hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and bewilderment. "Elias, what did you do? Did you set this up? This is your sister's day. You're ruining her ceremony." I didn't answer him. Couldn't. My throat was tight, and my eyes were burning. Helena stepped toward the edge of the stage, her hand resting on the wooden railing. She looked down at the crowd, then back at me, her face a mask of disbelief. For 2 years, she had been the one with the power, the one with the stories, the one who mattered. In her mind, I was the static. But the static had become the signal. The simple people she had looked down upon were now shouting her brother's name with a fervor they hadn't even shown for her return. The chant reached a crescendo, a deafening, singular pulse of sound that seemed to stop time itself. "Elias! Elias! Elias!" I saw Helena's hand grip the railing so hard her knuckles turned ghost white. She looked like she wanted to command the world to stop, to return to the version of reality where she was the hero and I was nothing. But the world wasn't listening to the captain anymore. The general stood up. He didn't look angry, he looked intrigued. He walked to the edge of the stage, standing beside my sister. He looked down at me, then at the sea of people chanting my name, and then he looked at Helena's shocked, pale face. "Captain," the general said, his voice carrying even without the mic through a momentary dip in the noise. "It seems we might have missed a very important part of the briefing regarding this town." Helena couldn't even respond. She just stared at me, her eyes flickering with the first realization that while she was away earning medals, I had been earning the one thing she couldn't command, the heart of the people she thought she was protecting. The chanting continued, a relentless, beautiful noise, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like I was finally truly visible. The mayor reclaimed the microphone, but he didn't use his politician voice this time. He looked directly at the stage, specifically at the row of decorated officers who sat in their rigid, polished perfection. The chanting began to taper off into a heavy, expectant silence, but the air remained charged, vibrating with the energy of the crowd's demand for recognition. "Captain Vance," the mayor said, turning toward Helena. She stood frozen, her hand still white-knuckled on the railing. "You spoke today about the simple lives we lead while you are away. You spoke about the security provided by the uniform, and you are right. But there is a kind of security that doesn't come from a rifle. He gestured to the silver-haired veteran, the one who had been standing near me earlier. The man stepped onto the stage. He didn't have a dress uniform. He had a faded army surplus jacket and a slight limp. "This is Sergeant Miller," the mayor announced. "He served 3 tours before most of us were born. And 6 months ago, he was 3 days away from being evicted from the house his father built. The system had failed him. The paperwork was lost in a mountain of bureaucracy. He was a hero who had become invisible." Helena's eyes darted to Miller, then back to the crowd. She looked like she was trying to calculate a tactical retreat from a conversation she didn't understand. "It wasn't a government agency that saved him," Miller said, leaning into the microphone, his voice gravelly and firm. "It was a kid who worked at the youth center. A kid who sat in my kitchen for 4 nights straight, tracking down every lost form, calling every office in the state, and refusing to leave until the bank backed down. And when I asked him why he cared, he told me that a town is only as strong as the people who look out for each other when the cameras aren't rolling." Miller looked down at me from the stage, his eyes shining with a fierce, protective light. "That kid is Elias Vance," Miller shouted, his voice cracking the silence. "And he didn't stop with me." The general, who had been listening with a sharp, analytical gaze, stepped forward. He wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at the ledger that the mayor had just handed him, a thick folder filled with names, dates, and testimonies. "Captain," the general said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made everyone on stage stiffen. "I've spent my career measuring impact in terms of territory gained and objectives met. But look at this." He held up the folder. "This is a record of a different kind of campaign. While your unit was deployed, this young man, your brother, built a coalition. He organized the Homefront Network. He secured funding for a mobile clinic that treats the families of our active-duty soldiers who can't afford the drive to the base. He started a vocational program for veterans returning with PTSD who couldn't find work." The general turned to Helena, his expression unreadable. "He didn't just stay behind, Captain. He held the line. He made sure that when your soldiers came home, they actually had a home worth coming back to." The revelation hit the stage like a physical blow. My mother let out a small, strangled sob, her hands covering her mouth as she looked at me, truly looked at me, for what felt like the first time in a decade. My father was motionless, his face a mask of profound, shattering realization. The town flake, the son he had spent years dismissing as unmotivated, was the architect of the very stability he bragged about. But it was Helena's reaction that was the most visceral. The steel sentinel was crumbling in real time. She looked at the folder in the general's hand, then at the sea of faces in the crowd, people who were nodding, crying, and looking at me with a reverence she thought was reserved only for those in camouflage. The silence on the stage was deafening. Helena looked down at her own medals, the gold and silver she had used as a shield to justify her arrogance. She had treated her life like a mountain and mine like a valley. She had assumed that because I wasn't moving toward a target, I wasn't moving at all. "Elias," she whispered. It wasn't a command or an insult. It was a broken syllable of recognition. She looked at me across the gap between the stage and the VIP chairs. The distance was only a few yards, but the reality of what I had done, the sheer scale of the labor I had performed in the shadows of her spotlight, made that gap feel like a canyon she didn't know how to cross. She saw the veteran who had spoken. She saw the young mother, Sarah, who was now holding up a hand-painted sign that simply said, "Elias saved our family." She realized that while she had been off becoming a legend in the history books, I had become a legend in the hearts of the people standing right in front of her. The general looked back at the mayor and nodded. "This isn't on the official military program," the general said, "but I believe the Civic Merit Award is an understatement. If this young man had done this in a combat zone, I'd be pinning a star on him myself." He turned back to Helena. "Captain Vance, I think it's time you stepped aside. Today isn't just about the soldiers who left. It's about the one who stayed." Helena took a staggering step back. The crowd began to cheer again, but it wasn't a roar of anger anymore. It was a roar of vindication. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, as the general gestured for me to come up the stairs. I passed my father, who couldn't even meet my eyes. I passed my mother, who reached out to touch my sleeve as if to confirm I was real. And then I climbed the steps. As I reached the top, I came face to face with Helena. She looked small. For the first time in our lives, the big sister looked lost. Her eyes were searching mine, desperate for a sign of the brother she had ignored on the street. But I didn't give her a smile and I didn't give her a scowl. I just looked at her with the same steady, quiet resolve I had used to rebuild this town. The truth was out. The hero was standing in the presence of the man she had tried to make invisible, and for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. I stood at the center of the stage, the wood creaking beneath my boots, the same boots that had walked every alleyway and back office of this town while the world was looking elsewhere. The general stepped back, crossing his arms with a nod of profound respect, leaving me alone at the microphone. The roar of the crowd was a physical heat, a standing ovation that felt like the sun breaking through a decade of winter. Beside me, Helena was a statue of cracking marble. The rigid posture she had maintained since her first day at West Point seemed to be failing her. Her hands, usually so steady they could hold a rifle without a tremor, were twitching at her sides. She looked at the crowd, then at the general, and finally, she turned her head to look at me. For the first time in my life, she wasn't looking down. She was looking across. The mayor handed me the heavy glass award, but I didn't look at it. I looked at my parents in the front row. My father's head was bowed, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, the posture of a man realizing he had spent his life worshipping a statue while neglecting the son who was building the foundation. My mother was weeping openly, not with the performative pride she had shown for Helena's medals, but with a raw, shameful grief for the years she had spent treating me like a disappointment. I leaned into the microphone. The square fell so silent I could hear the flag snapping in the wind. "I didn't do any of this to be standing here," I said, my voice steady, echoing off the stone facades of Oakhaven. "I did it because when you love a place, you don't leave it behind. Not even when the world tells you that the only way to be a hero is to go somewhere else. A town isn't just buildings and streets. It's the people who are left when the parades are over. It's the families who wait, the veterans who are forgotten, and the kids who need to know that staying home isn't the same thing as giving up." I turned slightly toward Helena. She flinched, a small but unmistakable movement. "Service has many uniforms," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "And today I think we all finally understand that." The applause broke out again, but I didn't stay for the handshakes. I handed the award to Sergeant Miller, who was standing at the edge of the stage, and I walked toward the stairs. I needed air. I needed to be away from the cameras and the sudden, suffocating pride of a family that had only recognized my value once it was validated by a general. I walked to the back of the square, near the old oak tree where Helena and I used to play before she decided that duty meant leaving me behind. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, amber shadows across the grass. A few minutes later, I heard the rhythmic, heavy click of military heels on the pavement. I didn't turn around. "Elias." Her voice was different. The commanding, sharp edge was gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling uncertainty. I turned to see Helena standing a few feet away. She had taken off her officer's cap, and her hair was slightly disheveled. The medals on her chest seemed to weigh her down now, no longer symbols of superiority, but anchors. "The general is looking for you," she said, though it was clearly an excuse to speak. "He wants to talk to you about a National Advisory Board for Veteran Affairs. He's never talked about a civilian like that before." "I'm not interested in boards, Helena," I said quietly. "I have work to do here." She took a step closer, then stopped, as if there were an invisible barrier she was afraid to cross. She looked at the ground, her jaw working as she fought for words that didn't exist in a field manual. "I ignored you," she whispered, "on the street, at the table, for years. I thought that because I was the one in the line of fire, I was the only one who was sacrificing. I thought you were just waiting for life to happen to you." She looked up, and I saw that her eyes were wet. The steel sentinel was gone. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming out in a choked rush. "You weren't waiting for life to happen, Elias. You were making sure life was still possible for everyone else. While I was away fighting for a country, you were here saving our home. You're more of a soldier than I ever was. You didn't even have an order to do it. You just did it." She reached out, her hand trembling, and for the first time in years, she touched my arm. Not a dismissive pat, but a desperate, grounding grip. "I'm sorry," she said, the two words cracking under the weight of a decade of arrogance. "I didn't see you. I'm so sorry." I looked at my sister. I saw the girl she used to be, and the woman the military had turned her into, and the humbled sister who was now standing in the wreckage of her own pride. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I just felt a profound, quiet relief. The war between us was finally over. "You're home now, Helena," I said, placing my hand over hers. "Actually home. This time, don't just march through. Stay a while. See what we've built." She let out a shaky breath and nodded, leaning her forehead against my shoulder. The parade was over, the crowds were thinning, and the hero of Oakhaven was finally, for the first time in her life, standing in the shadow of the brother she had once tried to forget, and she was perfectly fine with the shade.